But okay, let's be serious. Now we are already recording.
Yeah.
David, so thank you for continuously pushing the right stuff in America. But to be honest, after last Ankara NATO summit, I was a bit positively confused. Well, it's difficult to read from those very few lines of NATO declaration that is kind of one page. But, you know, the statement about Ukrainian contribution to NATO, it was like, well, for me, like the man who was also pushing Lithuania to NATO, it looked like pre-warming Ukrainian chances to get into NATO.
Well, Žygis and Vincentas, thank you for having me back. And before we start, this is July 22nd, and I have to wish you a very healthy and happy birthday. We need you. You are a leader in the cause of freedom. So I think on behalf of everyone, Žygis, a very happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Of course. On Ukraine, I think there is a change in the views and attitudes of the administration toward Ukraine. And I think in the Trump administration specifically. And I think that is due to the changing momentum that we see in the war, where Ukraine has gained the upper hand. Russia is very much on the defensive. And that is attributable in part to the medium and long range strikes by Ukraine against Russian targets, including energy targets, targets in Moscow, targets in St. Petersburg. Of course, the St. Petersburg Economic Forum was targeted, not the forum itself, but nearby. And so the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky was much more positive than I think we've seen in some past meetings. And I think it comes down to the fact that Trump likes a winner, and he's starting to think that Ukraine is winning. And I think that is the main change. The big question will be whether that change in attitude will translate into a change in policy. He announced at the Ankara summit in the meeting with Zelensky that he would approve allowing Ukraine to produce the Patriot missiles, provide the license. The problem with that, while that's good symbolically, that won't really kick in for another year or two at most, although one should never underestimate Ukraine's ability to innovate and move quickly in terms of production of what they need. What Ukraine needs right now are Patriot missiles or the equivalent in order to intercept Russian cruise and ballistic missiles. The United States and our allies who have those missiles need to do a much better job. That, of course, is complicated by the ongoing war between the United States and Iran, where some of these munitions and weapon systems are being used in that battle, and that will make getting Ukraine what it needs more difficult. But I do think that there is a change in the thinking and the attitude and the approach, but it needs to translate into policy. And that includes, by the way, passage of the legislation that Senator Graham had been trying for more than a year to get through the Senate. It wasn't even brought up for a vote. Now you have other senators, including the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, saying this would be a great way to represent Senator Graham's legacy. You have Congressman Mike McCall, who's been a longtime supporter of Ukraine, like Senator Graham, saying that the House should also pass this measure. So you may see Congress doing some concrete things, passing this legislation, and that would be positive. So it needs to be providing weapons that Ukraine needs to intercept these missiles, providing Tomahawks so that Ukraine can hit even more targets, but also tighter sanctions and a clear siding with Ukraine so that there's no neutral status. There are rumors that Steve Witkoff will be returning to Moscow in August. I hope that won't be the case. I hope he will be preoccupied with the situation in the Middle East. Generally, when Witkoff shows up in Moscow, things don't go well. And of course, as you know, Witkoff and Jared Kushner, his colleague on these efforts, have been to Russia 7, 8, 9, this I think would be the 9th time, and they have been to Ukraine 0 times. And that's embarrassing. So the negotiating track that the U.S. has been pursuing has not worked. And while Witkoff, I think, deserves lots of criticism, the problem is Putin. Putin isn't interested in ending this war. He wouldn't know how to end the war, even if he were interested. And just today, the Russian authorities were reiterating that they will not withdraw from any territory, that they are demanding the territory that they still haven't seized militarily be turned over to Russia. No interest on Putin's side in ending this war. And that's the problem.
I mean, we all know how Russians operate. I mean, this is nothing new and nothing different than what we and yourself included would have expected. I think that the Ukrainians are proving, especially now, that the only way to actually, let's say, work with the Russians is to bring the war to them. And that is what the Ukrainians have been doing very successfully up until now. But this Patriot missile issue is indeed a big one. I remember being in Ukraine for the past 2 summers for conferences and the like, and feeling completely safe in Kyiv, knowing that it was surrounded by 4 Patriot batteries that were capable of taking out all or almost all of the missiles that were shot at it. Now that is no longer the case. Now we see tens and hundreds sometimes of people dying, civilians in apartment blocks. So, I mean, going back to the license to produce the Patriots, as you said, it's nice, I guess, a step in the right direction, but I'm very wary of being overly optimistic. And as always, I think on this podcast, I tend to be the sort of pessimistic one. But actually, I think what will be interesting to hear from your side, Mr. Kramer, is what is the feeling on the ground in the States? I mean, we actually don't, at least for me, in my feeds, let's say, of both news and social media, I haven't been seeing much when it comes to foreign policy coming out of the States other than Iran. And the only other news that I've been seeing is these fun gaffes and jokes about, your reflecting pool and your, all sorts of celebrations, but nothing actually concretely benefiting the world or actually America as well. So what's actually going down on the ground?
Well, Vincentas, I think your assessment is right. Aside from Iran, the United States is focused domestically. We have what are called midterm elections. These are for every House seat and a third of the Senate coming up in November. So there's been a lot of attention focused on that. There was a lot of attention, as you pointed out, focused on our 250th anniversary. The United States, when it comes to elections, generally focuses on domestic issues. They're pocketbook issues, as we say, depending on the wallet. And the economy is facing strains in the United States. Iran has pushed the Ukraine story off of the front pages. That's been true for a while, even before Iran blew up. But the latest news that has been in the media here in the United States when it comes to Ukraine has been the internal fighting within Ukraine. And President Zelensky's decision to dismiss his very popular defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov. And then yesterday, of course, he decided to replace the commander-in-chief, Syrskyi. And I think the first step was a mistake. It was a self-inflicted wound. The second decision, replacing Syrskyi, helps heal that wound. But I think it will be important to see Fedorov come back into a government role, whether it's defense minister again or some other role. That I think brought some unwanted attention to the situation there, which is, I think, particularly unfortunate given that Ukraine has had the momentum on its side, militarily, politically, coming out of the summit. I certainly understand Gigas's confusion coming out of it, but it went better for Ukraine, I think, than almost for anyone else. And there seemed to be unity. The statement that came out expressed support for Ukraine. And so I hope that Zelensky is able to bottle, if you will, the internal feuding that has been going on, get things back on the right track. Drapati, the new commander, is very highly respected, well regarded. I hope that's a positive move. And I think the likelihood that Ukraine will have U.S. produced Patriot missiles anytime soon is not high. That said, Ukraine is working on an alternative. And then there are these reports of Europeans coming up with a cheaper version of a Patriot missile, less expensive, that is. And so, again, the three of us have been saying this for a long time. Never underestimate the Ukrainians. Out of necessity, they will come up with a solution. And they seem to be working very hard on coming up with interceptor missiles of their own while they wait for very slow response from the West.
Just coming back to the same American puzzle, how to put it together on Ukraine, the same question continuing on what Vincentas asked you, because normally I'm used for America to putting us all together and, achieving some strategic goals. During, President Bush period, nobody wanted Baltics in NATO, and it was quite a straightforward message from White House. And, of course, our participation in different conflict opened the doors, and we are in NATO. And thanks, David, also for your efforts to making it through. But do you see any possibility that still till the end of Trump administration? Because as I said, usually all American administrations, till the end of it, they become more close to us. And taking into account that Trump likes winning. So if I would be Trump, I'm sitting in White House, I'm looking to different conflicts, Iran, Cuba, China arising. They have the weakest chain, actually, Russia. Even Ukrainians are beating them. So if I would be Trump, if I really want to be kind of Reagan, and I have his painting behind me, I would just push all the buttons on Russia. Even coming back to this NATO, invitation to NATO issue, we know, first of all, it's just a statement. And then it takes, 2-3 years to ratification. So, but that would make signal to Putin, game is over. My God, we didn't win American hearts. America is back on track. They decided to get Ukrainians in because in Ankara, a statement is quite okay. Because, some people in Vilnius say, well, wait for the Democrats, wait for Democratic president. But we know, they have the same problems. They are afraid to escalate. They had a chance with Biden to invite Ukrainian to NATO. So do you still see the chance that we can make American puzzle to work together finally after all those midterms? I don't know. I don't see big chance, but kind of after Ankara, I have a hope.
Actually, if I could jump in just before you give your answer, Mr. Kramer, I mean, even if, let's, for example, imagine that Trump didn't care or like winners at all, and if we looked purely at the self-interested perspective that, we like to talk about the Kushner family, the Trump family, and all sorts of things that, in some cases it looks like maybe diplomacy is, or the current administration's diplomacy is built on pure selfish economic interest. Even when you look at that, Ukraine is the winning horse. So why don't they back it?
A couple of things. One, and it comes back to your earlier question, Vincentas, about attitudes here. Despite criticism that we have heard from certain political leaders in the United States, the American people still broadly support Ukraine. They may not be following the situation closely, but when they get informed about what's happening, they rally around Ukraine. And so surveys conducted in the United States continue to show a majority of Americans support Ukraine. And that includes providing military assistance to Ukraine. One other interesting thing, I don't know what to make of this, to be honest. A social influencer, Laura Loomer, has been in Ukraine this week and has essentially said everything she said about Ukraine before was wrong, that she had fallen for Russian propaganda. I'm not on social media. I don't follow her. I don't follow anyone else for that matter. But she has a significant following, and she is influential with President Trump and people in his administration. That's something to keep an eye on as well. If she comes back and continues this line that Ukraine is the country we should be supporting in this, that Ukraine is the one that is fighting heroically, that could also influence, and it comes to your question, Gigas, about the possibility, could we see this? Had you asked me this 6 months ago, frankly, 3 months ago, I would have said no. And you're right that it was Biden in 2021 who said no to Ukraine when Zelensky was knocking on NATO's door. And he cited the issue of corruption then as the reason that we couldn't consider Ukraine for NATO membership. Then the Trump administration, when it first came in, agreed to the Russian demand that we take Ukraine and NATO off the table. Things are changing. And I think there is a changing perception, not just in the United States, but in the rest of Europe as well, that Ukraine is contributing to security on the European continent. It is not just reliant on others for its security. Ukraine has the most effective military in Europe right now. I think the largest military in Europe right now. Turkey is right around there. It has shown tremendous innovation. It is ahead of us, the United States, when it comes to drone technology and production. And the population, the people, sadly, tragically, have this experience that nobody else does in the alliance of fighting the Russians. And they know how to deal with this threat. So I would say now, if the momentum can continue where Ukraine continues to inflict the damage on Russia that it has been, that the casualty toll increases in Russia, I think there is a possibility by the end of President Trump's administration that he will want to make a push for Ukraine into NATO. It would be a pretty significant, almost remarkable change, where when he first came back into office in January of last year, people were worried about the future of NATO, that the United States might withdraw. We seem to be past that point. It's still not 100% certain, but we seem to be past that point. And it would be pretty remarkable if at the end of his administration, he would look to add a 33rd member to the alliance, meaning Ukraine, after Sweden and Finland were the most recent joiners of the alliance. And he likes to talk about how he is making history, that this has never happened before. This would be a pretty extraordinary accomplishment, and it will be helped, if it has any chance, by Ukraine's continued success on the battlefield.
Just maybe one follow-up question, because I know that our time is coming to an end. Sanctions. When I read my embassy reports, it seems that this question will be postponed to autumn, because like last days, or do you think still there is a little chance to do it, in summer? Because time matters a lot. And what kind of dynamics to this process would democratic win would bring? Like, will the House starts fighting with Trump on Ukraine, or actually not? It could be one of the points that you finally have bipartisan policy back in Washington that we still remember during your times. We had it. Now Washington is so divided, well, we have some cases in Europe, but it's really quite grave case, I would say. So,
and Gigas, you're talking about specifically U.S. sanctions, not EU sanctions, because there are some issues there too.
U.S. Yes,
US.
exactly. Yeah.
So again, I think out of the terrible tragedy of Lindsey Graham's passing, there may be the possibility for the sanctions legislation to pass Congress. There seem to be some differences between the House and the Senate on this. There are some Democrats who worry that this piece of legislation would give President Trump too much power when it comes to imposing tariffs on others. Still, I think there is a way to get this legislation passed. Senator Shaheen, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is strongly supportive. That will help get it across the finish line. The problem is there aren't many days left at least until the summer recess for Congress to get this done. And then if they don't get it done this week, they will be back in September. They have to pass budget issues, all sorts of things, the National Defense Authorization Act, and so on. There are two other problems, though. One is the implementation of sanctions, and these two problems are related. We imposed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil last October. Then we provided waivers when the Iran war first blew up in April and May. Those waivers have expired, but we have to make sure that we implement those sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. We also have to go after the countries and governments that purchase Russian energy. China and India are at the top of that list. India had cut back significantly when this first came up last year. And so my hope is that as this legislation gets more serious, we will see India and China on their own start to cut back. China is in an interesting position with Russia. It clearly has the upper hand there. And so if China were to cut back, that would be a blow to the Russians. The second point, related point to this, is the staffing within the Treasury Department. There is an office that I work closely with you, Žygas, if you remember, when it came to sanctions on Belarus. And this is OFAC, as it's called, the Office of Financial Action, something or other. Forgive me, I'm blanking suddenly on the name. But OFAC is the office that imposes and implements sanctions in the Treasury Department.
Yeah.
It's one of the most powerful and effective bureaus within the U.S. government. And if you remember, we worked closely with them in imposing sanctions on the Lukashenko regime in 2006 to 2008, and it is grossly understaffed. It needs more people in order to do the job because there are sanctions on Iran, there are sanctions in other places. And we have to make sure that sanctions that are announced, that are passed by Congress, that are mandated by legislation, actually are able to be implemented by people inside the Treasury Department. So that's an internal challenge for us. But I do think that there is the possibility to tighten the sanctions. The last thing I'll just say is, it is interesting that President Trump, right before the NATO summit, spoke to President Zelensky and President Putin, to Putin by phone, and then promised Putin he would call him after the summit. As far as I know, that call to Putin has not taken place. That too is worth noting because, as you know, they have had a close relationship over the years. And I haven't seen any reporting in either the Russian press or the American press indicating that President Trump has circled back with Putin. And so I hope that remains the case, because at least in their public statements, Russian officials have shown no interest again in ending this war. Their position remains very hardened and the same, which is Ukraine essentially has to surrender. As long as that's the case, I don't think President Trump has anything to talk to to Putin about.
Actually, one last thing on sanctions. I know you have to run, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. I think that one of the key obstacles that we haven't mentioned when it comes to adopting sanctions packages within the Congress has been the White House. It hasn't been our friends on both sides of the aisle in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. It has been the White House that has been essentially handing down the idea that maybe hold off on this. Well, I'm being very polite here, but I assume it's far more harsh than that. And this is something we can't forget. So that's why it is interesting to, I think, look at the changes in mood, maybe. I mean, after Senator Graham's death, God rest him, Trump even, maybe it might have been a gaffe or a funny quip, but he had mentioned that maybe now, out of respect for the senator, it might pass finally. What do you think of that?
He has said that. Now, more recently this week, he has indicated he wants Iran sanctions included in that legislation. I don't know whether that is his and the White House effort to slow down this legislation, because that will complicate things. And but you're absolutely right, Vincentas. He has said that this legislation would be the best way to remember Senator Graham's commitment to Ukraine. And I think that's right. I mean, again, remember, Senator Graham and Senator Blumenthal announced this legislation more than a year ago. And how many times have we heard, particularly Senator Graham, say, it's this week or it's next week, and it kept. There's an old, I won't say, there was Lucy and the Football, a Charlie Brown comic strip where she would always move the football just as Charlie Brown would go kick it. And that seemed to be the case with this legislation. It kept getting moved further and further back. So I do hope that there is recognition inside the White House, including with the president, as well as with Senate and House leadership, that this is the best way to remember Senator Graham, to pass this legislation, to do it this week before Congress goes out for summer break. And because the sooner it happens, the more difficult it will be for the Russians. Tightening the screws economically, financially on Russia is a huge part of solving this puzzle. Providing military assistance to Ukraine is the other part of this. And standing with Ukraine unambiguously. No neutral position, no effort to try to broker the two sides. Any U.S. efforts in this process should make it clear we stand with Ukraine, and not with Russia, not in between the two. We stand with Ukraine. We are going to help Ukraine until Putin decides enough is enough, or the troops, or the Russian troops on the front line, decide they have had enough. I think the latter, Russian troops saying, forget it, we're just being sent to get slaughtered, is more likely than Putin changing his mind. I'm not predicting that the Russian troops on the front lines will wave the white flag, but there's certainly recognition that they are getting treated horribly. And it's why you see the Russians rely on North Koreans, why you see them traffic people from Africa and South Asia, sending them to the front lines, and why you see African governments increasingly criticize Russia for basically deceiving African students and others who go to Russia, sending them to the front lines, relying on prisoners. All of these things, all of those things are not a sign of a strong power. They're a sign of a desperate power. And yet Putin still seems to think that he can win. We have to make it clear to him that is not going to happen.
Amen. And on that note, thank you very much once again, Mr. Kramer, for joining us.